Okay, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to our fifth webinar in our post-2020 webinar series. My name is Timothy Blatch, and I'm a professional officer in the ICLEI Cities Biodiversity Centre here at ICLEI Africa in Cape Town. And we just want to warmly welcome everyone who's on the line yeah, really just welcome you. And I'm just going to go through some house rules before we begin. Firstly, the webinar will be recorded and the recording will be made available to you, to all those who have registered, along with a few different attachments of resources that will be mentioned by the various presenters. Towards the end of the webinar, once the presentations are done, we will open the floor for some questions and discussion. At which point there are two ways in which you can ask a question, either by raising your hand or by typing in the question box. Both of those options are in the panel on the right of your screen. So thank you for joining us. We are always so grateful to have so many people in attendance, and we look forward to what is promising to be a very great webinar. So today we are going to be looking at some feedback on some ICLEI processes and engagements towards the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and the position of local and subnational governments therein. The broad agenda: firstly, Ingrid Coetzee, the Senior Manager for Biodiversity and Nature-Based Solutions in ICLEI Cities Biodiversity Centre, will present an overview of the Open-Ended Working Group, the first meeting of that group, which was held in Nairobi, Kenya, last week from the 27th to the 30th of August. And Ingrid will also provide a bit of an update on the work of the Informal Advisory Group on mainstreaming, on which Ingrid sits. Thereafter, Kubi Brandt, the Regional Director of ICLEI Africa and the Cities Biodiversity Centre, will give a presentation on shaping the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, focusing on ICLEI's 10-point framework for subnational biodiversity action. And this 10-point framework is essentially the beginning of ICLEI's position statement, a draft of which was floated at the Open-Ended Working Group. At the end of both the presentations, we will open the floor, as I mentioned, for some questions and discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ingrid. Ingrid, thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Hello, everybody. So before I start my presentation, I just want to locate us in terms of where we are on the roadmap towards COP15. You'll see there in the top half of your screen to the right, it's webinar number 5. And in this week of this month of September, we have quite a few events that have been organized around the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework process. There's going to be a special session at the United Nations General Assembly, and there's a range of other meetings that have also been organized that we haven't included on this diagram, but just to let you know that it's a very busy month. And then leading up to also there's a meeting in Ramsar, a Ramsar meeting later this month, towards the end of this month. And then the momentum really picks up in October, November, where we have the CBD SABSTA meeting, and in December, the climate COP. So it's a busy time for all in this whole process of negotiating and developing a new global biodiversity framework. And I'm going to just talk a little bit about the meeting that was held last week, the Open-Ended Working Group meeting. It was the first meeting of this working group, and it was held in Nairobi from the 27th to the 30th. And then I'll also just provide you with some information on the latest workings of the Informal Advisory Group on mainstreaming biodiversity. So just to give you some background, the Open-Ended Working Group was established at COP14 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt last year. And the idea of that working group is that as part of the preparatory process for developing the new global biodiversity framework, this intersessional working group was established. It's chaired by Mr. Francis Ogval of Uganda and Mr. Basil van Haave from Canada. and they are tasked with supporting the preparation of the new global biodiversity framework, but also in the lead up to COP15, which will be held towards the end of next year in China, to also coordinate the negotiations prior to the COP meeting. And the process, the post-2020 process, is a very full process. It started earlier this year with some regional consultations held all over the world. There are thematic meetings that some of them have been planned, some of them are still in the pipeline, being held this year and into next year. And it covers a whole range of themes and topics, for example, ecosystem restoration, resource mobilization, area-based conservation. And in addition to the United Nations-led meetings, there are also other important meetings. For example, in July of this year, there was the Biodiversity Science Conference in Trondheim, and there's also been a conference on coordination with other conventions, which was held in Bern. And then, of course, the open-ended working group meetings, and there are 3 planned. The first one, as I said, took place last week. The next one is going to be held in February in 2020 in Kunming, China. And then the last meeting will be held in July of 2020 in Cali, Colombia. In addition to that, there are the usual CBD subsidiary body meetings. There's one on scientific, technical, and technological advice, which is going to be held in Montreal at the end of this year, November this year, and another one in May next year. And then the subsidiary body on implementation, the SBI meeting, will be held also in Montreal next year in May. So what happened at this first meeting? It was a very well attended meeting. It consisted of representatives from the parties to the convention, as well as to the protocols under the convention. And then there were also many observers, including a delegation from ICLEI and from other local government networks, as well as other sector groups and other UN bodies. The important thing to understand that this meeting was not a meeting on negotiation of content or texts for the new global biodiversity framework. Instead, its main focus was to get agreement, to discuss and get agreement on the structure of the new global biodiversity framework on the one hand, and on the other hand, the future work program leading up to COP15. Yeah, and then I think the other important thing is, although it was a very full agenda, there were essentially 3 important agenda items. The first being the reports on the consultations that had been held previously for the first part of the year, as well as other contributions to the post-2020 process, for example, the IPBES reports, etc. And then the bulk of the meeting actually focused on the structure of the proposed new global biodiversity framework. In other words, we looked at the potential elements and what the scope would be of such a framework. And then the last sort of important item on the agenda was to look at the future work program of the working group and to allocate tasks and just sort of set timelines and timeframes. Then if we just stop for a moment and look at the key outcomes, there were many outcomes, but I think the most important ones was the adoption of the non-paper on the possible elements of the global biodiversity framework, which incidentally is available on the CBD website. And they also came up with a whole plan of meetings, consultations, workshops that are being held from now till the COP15 Conference of Parties in China. They also agreed to the dates of the work program of the open-ended working group, and there was agreement that the co-chairs would prepare a draft, zero draft text that would be discussed at the next working group meeting in February, and that this would be ready in advance so that obviously parties and observers can study it. And then I think the other important thing is that they agreed that at the SABSTA meeting, which will be held in November in Montreal, there will be guidance provided on specific goals, on the SMART targets, indicators, baselines that would be appropriate, the monitoring frameworks, and then how one would achieve transformational change within the scope of the 3 conventions of the objectives of the convention. Insofar as the possible elements are concerned, the important things there to understand is that the main elements are that it would start off with the rationale, explaining the rationale, and then set out the scope. It would reiterate the 2050 vision, and next there would be a section dealing with the 2030 mission, as well as apex goal and some milestones related to that. Obviously, an important part of the new framework would be to address things like goals, targets, sub-targets, indicators, how these would be structured, etc. At the moment, there's no real clarity. There are different options on the table. And then, of course, it would talk to the means of implementation and what the appropriate enabling conditions would be. And there would be a section on what they call cross-cutting issues and approaches. And these are things, for example, like mainstreaming, partnerships, indigenous peoples and local communities, gender equity, intergenerational equity, connectivity, etc. And then also very importantly, a section dealing with transparent implementation, monitoring and reporting mechanisms, what these should look like and how they would work. And the last section would deal with the topic of outreach, awareness and uptake. So as I said earlier, this was not a negotiation. This is just the elements. There's no real substance yet. That all needs to still be brought in. But what is important to just take note of is that there's a deadline of 15 September this year for any submissions on the structure, on the possible elements, and these should be submitted to the Executive Secretary, and you would find more information on the CBD website. So what did this meeting mean for the local and subnational government constituency? Well, one of the important things is that ICLEI, through our regional director, Kirby Brunt, made 2 presentations on behalf of this constituency. The first was on behalf of ICLEI and the Advisory Committee on Subnational Governments, and that was in the opening plenary session. So that was an opening statement, and that was a 6-minute statement, basically setting out what our sort of ambitions are and our expectations, and introducing the 10-point framework that ICLEI has developed, and Kirby is going to be talking about a little later this afternoon. And then the second statement was on the 29th of August, which was a shorter statement, but also again presented by Kirby, and this time on behalf of the local and subnational government constituency. And that spoke to the sort of looking forward, the future work program, again referred to the 10-point framework and a few other elements. So another important thing is, and I think this was something that came out through the course of the week, and in a sense largely reflecting back on the opening statement that could be made, but also the sort of past decade or so of engagement of local and subnational governments through the summits, the Biodiversity City Summits, and that there were no less than 17 parties that referred to local and subnational or subnational governments in their submissions on the discussion around the elements for the new framework. And there was a very strong agreement that local and subnational governments have an important role to play in the new global biodiversity framework. For example, in the concluding remarks, the co-chairs reaffirmed the need for continued and active engagement of all subnational governments. And the contribution, also they recognize the contribution that all subnational governments make to developing a robust new framework. Something else that came out was that the objectives of the convention needed to be treated equally, and these obviously also have implications for local governments where in a way, the rubber hits the road, where a lot of the goals and actions that are agreed to will be implemented. And then another important thing is that the parties felt that the NBSAPs are here to stay. The vertical integration is very important in ensuring implementation and achievement of targets. And obviously, with that whole emphasis on vertical integration, local and subnational governments will play a big role. And linked to the thing about NBSAPs was the feeling that the national reports had to align better to NBSAPs, which again means that in future there will be a greater emphasis for a need for information from subnational levels of government. And then the other thing that was important is that many of the cross-cutting issues that were discussed have implications for local and subnational governments. And I mean, things like mainstreaming, the whole issue of partnerships, etc. So some of the views that the parties expressed, I'm not going to go into all of them, but there was some views around the importance of prioritizing the equitable distribution of the costs of biodiversity conservation, as well as the benefits across all levels, from local to global, and that it doesn't just accrue at the global level. As I said just now, the cross-cutting issues were important, and there was a feeling that there needs to be goals, targets, and indicators set around things like mainstreaming, connectivity, etc. Something else that was raised quite a lot was that you know, cities and local and subnational governments have to be engaged in the process going forward, and a lot of emphasis on the review of the plan of action on subnational governments, cities and other local authorities, which had been adopted in Nagoya a decade ago, which comes to an end. And that is also something that ICLEI has raised in its submissions. And finally, that there was also some support mentioned to the ICLEI's draft 10-point framework as contributing to the post-2020 negotiations and discussions, specifically in regard to what cities and subnational governments can do. Some of the meetings that are lined up, and there are really very many, so I'm not going to go into all of them. I just want to give you a snapshot. As I said earlier, there will be a SAPSA meeting in November in Montreal, which will be a more technical meeting. But then also there's a local and sub-government workshop that is being organized in Brazil in early February next year. There are the two Openended working group meetings, which I have mentioned already, and another subnational level meeting that is going to be taking place in April of next year is being organized by the Scottish government. And then the various thematic workshops, there will be the workshops on ecosystem restoration, resource mobilization, capacity building. Many of these things do have implications for local governments. And another meeting that comes to mind is the IUCN World Congress, which is being held in Marseille in the middle of next year. And there's also going to be a really strong focus and emphasis on specifically cities. And now I want to just spend a few minutes talking about the work of the Informal Advisory Group on mainstreaming. We have reported in previous webinars that ICLEI is the representative of the whole of the local and subnational government constituency on this working group. And there have been some meetings in the past, which we've also reported on, but I thought it would be good just to give some reflections on what's happened and how the issue of mainstreaming was dealt with at the informal Open-Ended working group. So one of the things that I think was important coming out of the meeting last week in Nairobi was that as far as mainstreaming is concerned, it certainly does, they recognize it does relate to local and subnational governments, and that there needs to be, this is something that needs to happen across government and across all sectors, and not just within the sectors. And the second thing is that at the level of subnational governments, whether these are cities or metropolitan areas or provinces or states or whatever, there is broad support for mainstreaming, because this is where a lot of the actions will be implemented, where a lot of the impacts are felt, and also there are very many instruments that can be used at the subnational levels of government very successfully for mainstreaming. So the advisory group supports the idea of mainstreaming as a cross-cutting issue, and I think probably the most important thing is that it's seen as the pathway to transformative change, and there's a lot of expectations in terms of what will come out for the new global biodiversity framework. Another point that is important is that has been made by the informal advisory group is that one needs to harmonize biodiversity and development strategies between all levels of government. Again, this whole concept of vertical integration, and then secondly also to support the decentralized or support the concept of decentralized cooperation for mainstreaming purposes. At the moment, the advisory group is focusing on preparing the long-term approach to mainstreaming, or the LTAM, and the objective or the goal behind this long-term approach to mainstreaming is that it needs to come up with priorities for action as far as mainstreaming is concerned. It needs to show what the scientific evidence is of likely impacts and benefits of mainstreaming. Needs to identify who the key actors will be to give effect to mainstreaming, and then also address the past decisions taken around mainstreaming and make sure that those are taken forward and they are implemented. For example, there was a very important decision on mainstreaming taken at the COP last year in Sharm el-Sheikh, and then there's also the Cancun Declaration on mainstreaming, which was adopted in the COP14 in Mexico in 2016. And at present, what's happening as far as the long-term approach to mainstreaming is concerned is that we're developing what the elements are. In other words, what is the skeleton of the long-term approach to mainstreaming? There are various issues, topics that are being considered in dealing with this whole cross-cutting issue of mainstreaming, and these are quite diverse. They vary from things like risk management, how do you mainstream issues of avoidance or mitigation or offsetting the cost of loss of biodiversity, and clearly this is something that does have implications for subnational levels of government. The questions around, or not so much the questions, but the importance of nature-based solutions, nature in cities, very importantly land use and spatial planning. And then I think that one of the messages that is coming across is that it's no longer good enough just to make small concessions or small changes, but we need to come up with a business unusual approach if we are going to have any success in bending the curve in loss of biodiversity. Something else that's being discussed is the need for effective regulatory instruments, or what they would look like, incentives, the question of awareness raising at all levels, political, technical, within society, the need for long-term education, and as I've said earlier, the fact that the NBSAPs, the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans, are seen as an important mainstreaming tool. So there are various challenges as far as developing the long-term approach to mainstreaming, challenges that prevent mainstreaming from happening or hinder it, and we need to look at what the solutions are. There are certain gaps that need to be addressed and that have been identified already. It's difficult sometimes to identify what are the priority actions and set timeframes. How do you determine smart targets across a whole range of different types of biomes, but also governance systems and countries. And then also, how does one pick up on some really practical recommendations that have been made in the recent reports that came out from the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, as well as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. For example, just to give you, just to mention one, there's the chapter 6 of the IPBES assessments that came out earlier this year talks about options for decision makers, and there's a whole section that deals with integrated approaches for sustainability cities, and what cities can do and how this can happen, etc. And then I just want to end off with one last slide, just to give you a sort of a quick snapshot around what lies ahead for the Informal Advisory Group. You will see that at the moment the emphasis is on the long-term approach to mainstreaming, and then the sort of end point is where the red arrow is pointing, is we're working towards the Open-Ended Working Group 3, which will take place towards the end of July, early August of next year. And the idea is that by that stage we will come out with a report, a document that has some very concrete proposals that can then be taken up. And Tim, with that, I'm going to end my presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ingrid. It's always great to get a bit of a snapshot of where we are on the roadmap to 2020 in terms of the various processes and engagements that are taking place and that ICLEI has been a part of. Yeah, so thank you to Ingrid for your presentation. Next up, we have Kobe Brandt. As I mentioned, she is the Regional Director of ICLEI Africa and the city's Biodiversity Center. And Kobe is going to present on a very exciting draft of ICLEI's 10-point framework for subnational biodiversity action. And this is the sort of emerging thought around the local and subnational constituency in shaping the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So Kobe, it's wonderful to have you here, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you to everybody who's joining us today. I think it is our fifth webinar in the series, and they will continue on a monthly basis till we go to Beijing together, or actually to Kunming rather, and with hopefully a very strong and consolidated statement by local and subnational governments. But as we know, well before we get to Kunming, this statement already needs to be formulated and feed into and inform the post-2020 framework discussions, which started officially now last week in Nairobi. And as Ingrid said, there's a very hectic schedule, so we're hoping that at the next Open-Ended Working Group, which is early in February, which will take place actually in China, in Kunming, the host city, we will have a consolidated statement which is wider than just ICLEI's statement at the moment. At the moment, what I'm presenting to you is an ICLEI draft statement, and there are still people within ICLEI, within our constituency of about 1,700, 800 cities and other subnational governments that are feeding into this 10-point draft. So within ICLEI, we expect some changes, etc. We certainly were informed of other aspects that we'd like to emphasize a little bit differently or more in the statement when we were in Nairobi last week. And we are now going to release this draft also to other networks of all levels of subnational government to comment on, to add to help shape, so that when we get to the next Open-Ended Working Group, we have a further draft, an extended draft which includes many more voices than just the ICLEI voice. So, but we are putting this out specifically to encourage everybody to engage with it. And I'm pleased to say that most of the 10 points that we highlighted actually also came out very strongly in the first round of discussions in Kenya last week. So it was good to see. It was a good ground truthing sort of exercise also for us. Now, I can, as a first point, I can maybe just talk briefly about why we need such a statement. Well, normally we do not engage in this level of intensity in the discussions and the negotiations ahead of a COP. But this COP is special for many reasons, and just for you to know that this is when the Aichi targets or the current framework that the parties agreed on will come to an end in 2020, and there will be a new global biodiversity framework agreed on by the parties. So for us, this year and a bit that is left, and it's just over a year that is left, is a very important period for us to make sure that our voices are heard, our collective voices are heard loudly and clearly in terms of what subnational and local governments can and should be contributing in a post-2020 world in terms of nature-based solutions, green-blue infrastructure, building and shaping our cities with nature, bringing nature back into our urban communities, the link between biodiversity and food, and biodiversity and climate, and all these aspects. So it is now that we need to speak up, and that we need to have very clear, sound messages that feeds into the thinking of the parties. And Ingrid mentioned, and I just want to mention again, that it was really significant that no less than 17 parties, some of them representing big groups of parties, like the EU, for instance, came out and spoke out very, very strongly, specifically naming local and subnational governments as fundamental independent spheres of government that they need to partner with to make sure that any post-2020 global biodiversity deal is actually implementable and implemented on the ground. What also came out strongly there was the fact that there needs to be a smart goal and smart targets that are set, meaning that they need to be measurable, specific, achievable, etc. And we know that cities and subnational governments really need to be part of any such framework to make that happen. So there was also a lot of talk, and we bring out this clearly in our statement as well, that we need a whole of society approach. And as more than half the world's population already live in cities, we see the trajectory just going up for that. We need to know that we need to fully engage these urban communities in calling for and acting on mainstreaming nature in their cities of today and of tomorrow. So I'm not going to stand still on this point. I think I've spoken to most of the sub points here, but just to know that you are all welcome to engage with us in these forums. We have a specific designated local and subnational government seating space in these negotiations, and all mayors, governors, city networks, other networks, and senior officials from cities and their networks are all welcome to join us at any one of these upcoming meetings. For all these meetings and the agenda for these meetings, you can please visit our roadmap, which is laid out and updated all the time on the citieswithnature.org platform. So by now, I hope that everybody tuned in here are already part of the Cities with Nature platform. It's very easy and it's totally free to join, but the benefits are multiple, and you will be able to then, if you are in the Cities with Nature website, you'll be able to see where you are in relation to other cities in terms of taking action now for nature. Because although 2020 is an important moment in time, we still have a year left of implementing what we have now in terms of targets, and a lot can be done in a year. And certainly the Cities with Nature platform, it's fully endorsed by the CBD, is going to become the reporting and commitment platform for cities and other subnational governments as we move into the post-2020 framework. So I would suggest to those cities listening and those networks listening, please encourage your cities, get on board now, start taking action, start sharing with other cities and with the rest of the world what you are already doing in terms of nature. So our 10 points, going through them quite briefly. This webinar will be made available to you afterwards for further details, and you can contact us anytime. So let me take you through them quite briefly. The first point that we're making, and the order of these points may also still change, but the first point is around the need for effective local multi-level governance mechanisms. It is widely understood already, for instance, in the climate space, in the SDG space, that we need all levels of government to act collectively and in a complementary way with clear mandates for each of these levels of government in terms of what it is they do and bring to the table and what they act on on a landscape approach basis related to biodiversity and nature-based solutions. Local governments, provinces, regions, prefectures, they all play vital parts when it comes to the implementation and the legal instruments at their disposal, like bylaws, etc., and the incentives they have at their disposal, the procurement aspects they have at their disposal to drive nature-based solutions in and around our cities and our regions. But they need clear policy frameworks, and they need clear support and mandates from their national governments. And this multi-level governance approach will also definitely assist in future national governments to be more inclusive in their reporting of what local and subnational governments are contributing to their own and nationally determined goals and policies, much as what we see happening in the climate space at the moment. So that's the first point. The second point is around an inclusive and action-oriented engagement mechanism, or mechanisms rather, not just one. We need mechanisms where a whole of society approach can really take action collectively and in complementary ways. So the fact that it needs to be inclusive and action-oriented is something we really want to emphasize. It cannot stop at the policy level, and it cannot stop at the national framework level. It needs to be brought down into actionable projects and actions and decisions that cities and other subnational governments take and implement on a daily basis. Our third point is around an increased national and local investment call for biodiversity and nature-based solutions. And the emphasis here is on national and local investment. Very often, we hear people saying, but there is no funding for implementing nature-based solutions. Biodiversity is at the short end of the string when it comes to funding, etc. But we also know that cities and subnational governments are very powerful overseers of very large budgets in many cases around the world. Even here in my country, in South Africa, most of the metro cities really oversee very large budgets. And it's about how we prioritize internally in these cities and towns and regions and provinces, how we prioritize these budgets, how we draft these budgets, what emphasis we put on the value of nature-based services in and around our cities and regions, and then properly budget accordingly. The instruments are limitless almost in terms of how we can budget in ways to incorporate nature-based solutions. For instance, when it comes to infrastructure, large infrastructure projects in our cities and towns, and when it comes to health and wellness programs, when it comes to school and educational programs when it comes to the youth, engagement and empowerment of women, addressing gender issues, etc., and addressing other issues like climate, etc. These things are all interrelated and interconnected. And the same goes for national governments. National governments often still regard it as a luxury to invest in biodiversity, whereas the latest reports tell us that we are facing a double crisis at the moment, double crisis, two sides of the coin, on the climate front and on the nature front. We know nature can survive without people, but not the other way around, and therefore national governments really need to reprioritize and rethink how they mainstream nature into their budgeting exercises, what sort of institutional mechanisms they set up to drive nature and biodiversity actions in their countries, what sort of policy and legal frameworks that they set up, and along with that comes how they divvy up the internal revenue available in that country from taxpayers and other sources of income. Our fourth point relates closely to that, and that's looking at the external investment community. Here we're talking both about your traditional donors as well as direct foreign investment into countries, but also the private sector. And there are many blended financing opportunities and other tools like green bonds, etc., that are all available and tested. The insurance industry needs to come to the table here as well with things like catastrophe bonds. Make it known that things like cat bonds exist and that cities can actually access that, you know. So what we are saying in this point is that there are not many clear and simple avenues that cities can easily follow and implement to attract and to actually successfully land such international funds that are out there from role players like private sector companies, your banks, your development banks, as well as your traditional donor community. So even some of the biggest funds are known to be a little bit difficult for cities and subnational governments to engage with and to successfully access. While a lot of work is needed in developing more bankable projects and to make the argument for investment, so more emphasis needs to be put on investment studies as well. The mechanisms available for funding these initiatives remain sometimes only at the national level, and cities and subnational governments are often not even in the room when such bilateral direct foreign investment agreements are reached between parties. Our fifth point that we're making is around the social benefits. And here we know science is emerging rapidly on a daily basis about the multiple benefits of nature in and around our cities for health and well-being, but health on many levels. You're talking about spiritual health, mental health, physical health, social health, and with that comes other benefits we've seen. For instance, if there's safe and open access in some of our poorer areas in our cities to green areas and urban parks, etc., you also see that the crime rates around these communities actually go down. So there are many other almost unintended positive consequences coming from mainstreaming nature in and around our cities, and it can really gel, it can really form very cohesive social communities within cities who need to be connected with nature, them themselves being part of nature. So it not only improves life, but it drives resilience, etc. And there are many financial, long-lasting financial benefits in having a healthier community. More days at work, less sick days, etc., etc. So the benefits are multiple. Our sixth point is around the interconnectedness with other global agendas, and I've spoken a bit about this already. But just to recap, I think we all know that, and the world, with reports from the IPCC Cities report to the latest IPBES report, and many other studies are coming out over the last months and will keep on coming out, that actually put scientific proof behind the knowledge that nature and climate are fundamentally linked, and you cannot address climate change without really mainstreaming nature as a major solution to addressing climate change on the planet. And I think more and more cities are actioning that, they're realizing that alongside parties, and it's a fantastic movement to see. So these cities that are at the forefront can form a very powerful community where at the city level, at that local level of governance, everything comes to the desk of the mayor. He needs to, or she needs to, ensure that the lights are on, that the traffic is working, that the roads are in good condition, that shops are kept open, that taps are running, and that you have access to clean drinking water, etc., etc. None of these, access to food, etc., none of these are possible without strong ecosystems that support these services. And these ecosystems spread beyond just the footprint of the city into landscape-based networks of green corridors, etc. And again, if these ecosystems are intact, and if we look after and preserve our green corridors and bring nature into our cities, like with massive tree planting exercises, and etc., green buildings, green roofs, all those things, urban farming, all those solutions, we are not only connecting the people back with nature, which is fundamentally needed, but we are also addressing a myriad of other SDG goals and climate goals and climate actions, as well as many of the other global development goals that the world has set. So it comes down to cities where the rubber hits the road and where action needs to be taken. So the interconnectedness with other global agendas for us is vital in addressing any new global deal that will come out of China. If we don't interconnect and mainstream, as Ingrid has mentioned before, then we know that the new global biodiversity framework, its goals and its ambitions will not be met. The seventh point is about knowledge, research and science, and there I will just very quickly say that we really need better data. We know this. We working in the city and subnational space, we understand that data is often not there. Reliable data that speaks to global frameworks, etc., that's not available readily, and much more needs to be done in terms of building up a science base of knowledge in terms of good practices, in terms of institutional governance challenges and opportunities, but also in terms of how to ensure that our natural systems stay intact as cities are rapidly expanding, or in some instances even shrinking, which again brings a whole lot of other possibilities and potential opportunities to such cities. So, but we need to understand the space better of how people engage with nature at the local level, and what sort of systems can be put in place to track progress that cities and subnational governments are achieving related to their goals and targets. And then, of course, how that can feed up into global reporting mechanisms. The eighth point is around change in lifestyle and consumption patterns. I've touched on this again. You can see these points do interlink with each other. So we understand that there's a need for the decoupling of consumption patterns and natural resources from both the quality of life as well as from local economies. And this is particularly possible through the promotion of non-extractive economic activities and development policies that internalize environmental and social costs. And this happens very well with the fantastic examples where cities have actually prioritized this action point in terms of procurement processes, in terms of putting out future scenarios for their cities that will attract the right type of investment, that will drive the right type of job creation activities, etc., that are building cities with nature, in harmony basically with nature. The ninth point is just simply around the call for a very clear call for a dedicated decision at COP15 focused on local and subnational governments, in the same spirit of decision 1022, which is known as the Plan of Action, which was the first dedicated decision on cities and other local government, subnational governments. And again, this plan of action is coming to an end in 2020, so we need another strong plan of action or something that can replace that decision that meant so much and enabled so many activities around the world. Our last point is the need for a platform of a reporting and commitment platform for and by local and subnational governments. And here we want to really ask you, have a look at citieswithnature.org. That already is such a platform where over 70 cities are participating actively in posting their objectives and their goals and aspirations and policies and plans, but also their projects and their successes, etc. And where cities naturally learn from each other, inspire each other, and connect. This sort of platform we see as something not replacing NBSAPs, which are definitely here to stay, but certainly strengthening and enriching NBSAPs, because the actions reported on Cities with Nature can very easily be consolidated at a national level and feed into enriched NBSAP reporting into the future. So with that, I want to end and just say thank you very much. Please engage with these 10 points. Tell us where we're right, where we're wrong, what we need to add, what we need to replace. And please, if you have inspiring examples that you want us to cite on Cities with Nature and if feed into this process, please do so. And I think Tim and all of us, we would just welcome hearing from you and getting your inputs. So with this, thank you very much. Back over to Tim.
Great, thank you, Kobe. There you have it, folks. That's the ICLEI's 10-point position in draft now. And as Kobe's mentioned, you know, feel free. We love hearing from you, and we would so appreciate your inputs and your thoughts in really seeing how inclusive we can make this position and statement. So there are contact details on the screen. And our contact details will also be sent to you in the follow-up email, along with the 10-point framework and the other resources mentioned by Ingrid, for example, the statements at the Openended Working Group. So thank you to Kobe and Ingrid, our speakers. It's been a great webinar today. And at this point, before we close, I'm just going to open the floor for any questions or points for discussion. So anyone who may have anything they would like to add or ask, as I mentioned before, you can either raise your hand and we will unmute you, or you can post a question in the question box on the right. I'll just leave this open for a few seconds to see if there are any questions. Okay, no questions for now, but we hope that we have prompted much thought and some ideas that we, you know, as we've said before, we just want to reiterate that this is an iterative process. We would really be grateful to get your thoughts and ideas. So perhaps let the information settle, and we so look forward to hearing from you. So on that note, thank you to everyone who has joined us, and we look forward to welcoming you to the 6th webinar, which will take place at the beginning of October, and all the details and links to register for that are available on the local and subnational engagement platform, the link to which will also be in the follow-up email. So thank you to everyone who's attended, and we will see you next time.